But first, a scene of horror and carnage in the Tasmanian town of Port Arthur tonight, where as many as 25 people have been shot dead in Australia's worst massacre. At least 15 people are wounded, and the gunman, who's still holding police at bay, is thought to be holding at least one person hostage. Most of the victims are reported to be tourists visiting the historic penal colony at Port Arthur.
Helicopters began ferrying the injured to Hobart from Port Arthur after a gunman opened fire there this afternoon.
We've had a gunman run amok on the Port Arthur historic site. That's 85 k's from Hobart. It happened mid-afternoon. There are at least 12 confirmed dead, if not 22. There's a further 15 injured. At the moment we have a hostage siege situation which we're attempting to contain and control.
The convict ruins are a favourite with interstate and overseas tourists. It's understood those visitors have made up the bulk of those killed or wounded. Locals near the site cringed in fear inside their shops and homes as the gunman opened fire.
Police arrest the gunman. Now the questions. Why did he do it? And why was he allowed such a deadly weapon?
Good evening everyone, and welcome back to this special one-hour edition of 790 News, incorporating Today Tonight, live from Port Arthur. Later, a full bulletin of local and world news with Ad Forward. But first, no words can express the horror and disbelief in this little Tasmanian tourist centre tonight. Port Arthur has become a town of crisis, of wounded crowded into hospitals, of police desperately trying to piece the massacre together, and of families shattered by tragedy.
Less than 36 hours after the gunman went on an indiscriminate rampage, the death toll stands at 35. The worst massacre by a single civilian in world history. The killer himself is in hospital with some of his victims. He was captured, his clothes ablaze as he ran from a burning building.
The horrific massacre at the historic penal settlement began without warning.
He did the gunshots.
Having murdered 32 unsuspecting local residents and tourists, the snipers stopped at a bed and breakfast lodge 5 kilometres north of the convict settlement and took 3 hostages, a couple in their 70s and a man who was earlier forced into the boot of a BMW and driven to the guest house. That car was later gutted by fire. Inside the Seascape Lodge, the man, armed with several high-powered rifles, continued firing at police, who were trying to negotiate by phone.
Our principle at the moment is to keep the house isolated and the people in it contained within the site, and we're hoping to open negotiations again. They've broken down because of some technical problems. A battery, I understand, and a phone that he had in the house ran out.
Has power to the
It's
house
as simple as that.
Victorian Special Operations Group police flew in to surround the house, where they lay in wait until dawn. Then, at 8 this morning, police were taken aback when they saw the Seascape Lodge burst into flames.
The upstairs portion of it is on fire, and there are flames coming from partly down on the lower level, on part of it. It's starting to slowly spread, I understand. There are still shots being fired, so at this stage I've given instructions that none of our personnel are to approach the house.
30 minutes after the fire began, the gunman himself walked out of the cottage, his own clothes on fire. He was immediately arrested by heavily armed Special Operations Police.
A person has been taken into police custody, conveyed to the Royal Albert Hospital, suffering from burns, no gunshot wounds.
The killer was taken by ambulance to a Hobart hospital. Under police guard, his head covered. He was wheeled into casualty and will face court as soon as his doctors allow. For 2 hours today, police escorted us to see the results of the killer's rampage. The house where his 3 hostages died was still smouldering. Having arrested the gunman, aged in his late 20s, police soon realised there were no survivors in the house. It burnt to the ground, leaving only the chimney and iron veranda post standing. The 3 hostages who died inside the cottage take the unbelievable death toll to 35, Australia's worst shooting massacre.
I think carnage is the simple way to describe it. It's probably the only single word that I know that would describe what was experienced in there.
The tourist region will reopen to the public in the next few days. The sudden and appalling slaughter now added to the region's already dark history.
Graham Derek Collier, in his police statement, stated, "When I was sitting down, I remember seeing this person enter the cafe. He came through the doors on my right. I noticed him because of his overcoat. I think it was green. It was a type of colour you don't see that often. That's why it stuck in my mind. I saw him carrying a long bag. It didn't seem unusual, because all backpackers have long bags. He seemed to be somewhere about 20. He had long, blonde, bedraggled hair, about 3 to 4 inches below the shoulder. He looked like he might have had a lot of acne. A pitted face.
Everyone who knew Martin Bryant agreed he had a flawless complexion.
My wife Elizabeth and I were both employees at Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority and were both working there the day of the massacre. My wife Elizabeth was murdered inside the gift shop section of the Broad Arrow Cafe, one of 20 victims murdered thereabouts. I know that Martin Bryant was not the gunman at the massacre at Port Arthur. How do I know? The coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, wrote a letter to a number of survivors of the massacre informing us that Martin Bryant was not the gunman at Port Arthur. In the letter dated the 31st of January 1997, the coroner, Mr. Matheson, wrote, "As a result of the outcome of the charges against Martin Bryant in the Supreme Court of Tasmania, I write to advise I do not intend to resume the inquest that I opened on the 29th of April 1996. I believe it is not in the interests of the family, friends or witnesses to again traverse the factual situation in a public hearing, particularly when any finding I make must not be inconsistent with the decision of the Supreme Court." Well, I thought long and hard about this statement and discussed the point with friends. You must understand that there were many other facts of the shootings inside the Broad Arrow Cafe that begged a proper, open investigation, including workplace safety issues, and especially the issue of the emergency exit, that were totally outside the issues of the gunman. It was the simple fact that the coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, believed that he could not make any finding that was inconsistent with the findings of the Hobart Supreme Court. That really stirred me. The Supreme Court can only make the finding of either guilty or not guilty in the matter brought before it. It follows that for Mr. Ian Matheson's inquest into the massacre at Port Arthur to make a finding inconsistent with the Hobart Supreme Court, then the finding could have only been Martin Bryant was not guilty of the charges brought before him. For the coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, to arrive at the decision not to resume the inquest into the death of the 35 people that were murdered at Port Arthur, the massacre due to this reason, which he himself provided, then the coroner must have been aware that Martin Bryant was not guilty of the serious offences which produced 72 charges against police brought against him that day.
The media handling of the events at Port Arthur could only be described as reprehensible. For instance, this picture appeared on the front page of the Tasmanian Mercury newspaper 2 days after the event. It could have influenced witnesses and ensured a fair trial for Martin Bryant was impossible.
By Tuesday, the newspapers had pictures. Murdoch's Hobart Mercury treated their picture in a most extraordinary way, unfolding their tabloid format into a broadsheet front page.
This is the man.
Our Tasmanian audience has his face obscured, but not the Mercury's readers. In a facile and futile attempt to avoid being in contempt of court by prejudging the man's guilt in Tasmania, where he'll be prosecuted, the Mercury explained the picture thus.
This is the man whom Tasmanians want to face 35 murder charges.
This is the man who allegedly...
Did they think that loan allegedly protected them?
Who allegedly, calmly, chillingly, coolly and brutally stalked and gunned down men, women and children.
This man is Martin Bryant, 28, a man of mystery from the Hobart suburb of Newtown.
All three Murdoch papers distributed in Tasmania, the Mercury, Herald Sun and the Australian, showed the man's face. No doubt gambling that identification would not be an issue in any prosecution and, dare I suggest, assuming that the authorities would lack the courage to take on the most powerful media corporation on earth. As to that, we shall see.
At 12:30 p.m, two young ladies stalled their van outside Seascape due to an overheated engine. Whilst both girls sat in the car waiting for the motor to cool down, a yellow Volvo pulled up behind them. The driver got out and spoke to the girls, and at one stage asked them if they had any marijuana to sell, which the girls then produced a sachet and sold it to the gunman for $50, which he paid for with a $50 note. The driver then told the girls that he was going to the Isle of the Dead to kill some wasps. When the girls tried to leave the van would not start, so that this person then again reached into the van, around the battery, said, "Here's your problem, you have a loose terminal." Fixed the leads to the battery, the van started and the girls took off. This person was not Martin Bryant. Martin Bryant does not smoke, nor does he partake in marijuana. Martin Bryant does not understand the electrical systems of motor cars. And thirdly, how would Martin Bryant know that two busloads of American tourists, derogatively called wasps, would have arrived at the Port Arthur historic site at approximately 12:30 p.m, so that they could board the ferry, the Bundina, to go to the Isle of the Dead at 1:30 p.m.
He said, there's a lot of wasps around today, there's not many Japs here, are there? And then started muttering to himself, and then walked inside, and that's when all the gunshots started going off.
At 10:40 a.m, two neighbours, Andrew and Lynn Simmons, were at their driveway, waiting for a car to arrive, when they heard two shots emanating from Seascape Cottage. It was these two shots, heard at 10:40 a.m, that killed David Martin. However, at this time, Martin Bryant is drinking coffee at the Shell service station at Fawcett, as per the witness Gary King. Martin Bryant was 58 kilometres away when David Martin was murdered. During the siege of Seascape Cottage, a police negotiator, Sergeant Terry McCarthy, established communications with Martin Bryant, who was calling himself Jamie. Sergeant Terry McCarthy stated it was his belief that Martin Bryant was speaking from some sort of a script. Sergeant McCarthy also established that Martin Bryant had an accomplice, who Martin called Rick. At times it appeared as though Rick was running the show, and it also became rather obvious that Martin Bryant knew Rick quite well. There were over 20 times recorded in the police transcript that shots were fired from another room of Seascape Cottage, whilst Martin Bryant was talking with the police negotiator. The gunman firing those shots could only have been Rick.